Like, in some ways, we could argue that his research concludes that maybe, there are psychics and there are mediums and they're real and they're really good at what they do, right? I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamere.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Welcome back to the Deliberating Practice podcast. I'm your host, Glenn, joined tonight, as always, by your other host, Richard. Good evening, Richard. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Glenn. How are you surviving with the heat there in beautiful Victoria?
I'm doing okay. It's pretty hot. YouTube viewers, actually Spotify viewers too, because we're doing video on Spotify now, might see me sweating a lot tonight. It's pretty warm here, but we are going to soldier through because we have a very important episode for our listeners tonight, as all of our episodes are, and that is to talk about Scott Miller. Richard, we did it. We're at episode 12. We are continuing the series of the Great Psychotherapy Debate. We have done it. We didn't just do one episode of the Great Psychotherapy Debate and then never revisit that idea again. We are actually holding good to the idea that we're going to do a series. So here we are with another episode of our little series, The Great Psychotherapy Debate. And tonight we are talking about Scott Miller.
Yeah.
Big Daddy Scott.
Big Daddy Scott. So I came across Scott about 12 years ago. I was just looking it up in an email.
Oh, yeah.
In a continuing quality improvement congress that was run by Ministry of Children and Family at the Langley Event Center. I live in Langley now. I did not live there then. And it was very well attended by health authority, by the ministry, by other community services. And I was really struck by Scott's jovialness and his optimism. And I think you had a lot of burnt out social workers and therapists there, and just his relatability, a very down to earth person and not arrogant in any way, right? For somebody who's contributed so much and created, again, a lot of debate within our industry and sharp as a tack as well. So a really interesting character to have all of those traits.
I think it's pretty cool, Richard. So like you met Scott Miller, or at least you attended one of his talks. So I think that's pretty neat, all the way back in 2012. And we might call you our resident Scott Miller expert, by virtue of that. You're just one degree of separation from Scott Miller. So it's great that you're here with me tonight to do this episode, because I'm pretty new to Scott Miller, actually. I've discovered him. We've referenced him before because I've discovered him maybe a couple of years ago. And who wouldn't? He's a big name in the Great Psychotherapy Debate. He's made a lot of contributions, as we're going to cover tonight. But maybe you can just say a bit about what you understand about Scott's career and sort of who he is and the place he has and within the debate, because he's a pretty significant contributor. Yeah.
Yeah. So, within the debate, I'll briefly just state the point that I was going to state. I think this really did create a lot of, I remember this just over a decade ago. It really rocked the field when he made the claim that non-therapists, so fortune tellers, shamans, others, could be more effective than psychotherapists. And then the field was scrambling. One element of the field, I think, was in denial about this and like, no, Scott, and you're wrong. And how could this be? And so it was heated, even at this quality improvement Congress. And others were really trying to adopt this and understand, okay, well, how is this so, and how can we improve our outcomes, right? And that's, I think, what we've been talking a lot about in the Great Psychotherapy Debate is this debate around outcomes, these debate around values in psychotherapy, effectiveness of psychotherapy. Why does it really matter? So I think we'll continue in that thread tonight.
Yeah. I mean, that's good to reference, right? Like Scott makes a very unique contribution to the debate. Like he's certainly not coming from the traditional position of just bringing another modality to the table and saying, look at this modality and isn't it great? And this is sort of a modality that is superior in effectiveness to all other modalities. He sort of actually is sort of humbled by the existing research, which demonstrates the opposite, and then sort of takes it upon himself to look at the clues that do point to effectiveness and to sort of follow that train and create a not an approach, but to emphasize certain points for practicing clinicians, I suppose, or to sort of follow a path or draw a map, in some ways to what effectiveness could be for clinicians. So yeah, maybe for our listeners and myself who don't really know. So like, do you know much about Scott's history? Like obviously he's a researcher and practicing psychotherapist, and he's an author. Like, do you know much about where he started, Richard, or?
No, I don't know too much of where he started, and his background is like, deep history. Yeah, no.
So I know that he was, and not really knowing his history, I know that he took Bruce Wampold's statistics class, so I know that much, which is sort of interesting, and that him and
Yeah.
Bruce have been friends for like 40 years, yeah, and so obviously he Bruce being a huge contributor to the Great Psychotherapy Debate himself, that's a good correspondence. But so Scott Miller sort of got his start as a brief solution focused therapist. I mean, that was a popular modality in the 80s and 90s, right? Like there was a real interest in brevity in therapy at that time, right? And a change to more pragmatic forms of therapy. So, but obviously was struck by the dodo bird effect, as Bruce was. Like really was challenged by the research that came out. What is it, John Norcross in the 90s,
Hmm.
demonstrating equivalency amongst the
That's correct. Yeah.
the modalities. So what we're going to do tonight is, so like Bruce, or not Bruce, Scott is a pretty prolific author and speaker. So it's easy to find a lot of his stuff on YouTube, and he's written a number of books. And so over the years, he's sort of developed a kind of central thesis. He's got a number of key points that he comes back to again and again, which we can understand as contributions to this debate around effectiveness in psychotherapy. And so we figured tonight we would review what we've distilled from his work as what we think are Scott Miller's kind of main positions in the world of psychotherapy. And then we can kind of talk about them and see if we can make sense of them and see how we feel about them and what we think of them in relation to psychotherapy effectiveness. So that's sort of the structure of the episode. So maybe we'll just sort of jump right in and look at what Scott Miller's all about.
Absolutely. And you are right that he began in the brief family therapy
I knew it.
centered model.
I knew it.
And he worked he always kind of introduced himself as kind of a Midwest kind of guy, like, again, this down to earth kind of nature that he had. And while that corresponds, he was working with homeless and underserved populations in Milwaukee before
Hmm.
he founded the International Center for Clinical Excellence, an organization comprised of
Right.
mental health professionals committed to advocating for excellence in behavioral health, thus feedback informed treatment, which is his baby.
His baby. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And we will be talking about feedback informed treatment tonight because that is, in many respects, the conclusion of Scott Miller's sort of sojourn through the research. Like the place that he has landed is that feedback is essential for effectiveness, and he has a whole kind of stance in that direction. So thank you, Richard, for synthesizing the history and helping us understand a little bit more about who Scott Miller is. So I mean, we've been talking about it, and maybe we'll just start with sort of the first point, which I think Scott does make reference to, and which informs a lot of his theorizing and the development of the direction that he's gone in terms of the debate. So he was struck by, and he stands firmly in the idea that there is equivalency amongst the modalities, so that modality is not a predictor of outcome. He doesn't see that. The research doesn't show that. Choosing one modality or the other is not necessarily going to lead to a more effective outcome. And so he that's where he starts in terms of that position. The kind of therapy that you do is not necessarily better, and it will not necessarily generate better outcomes. Switching stances in therapy, if you will. I think this is not surprising that Scott starts here, because this is sort of the beginning and the end of the debate around or at least it is the commonplace beginning place in the Great Psychotherapy Debate, right? Like this research, the sort of dodo bird effect, like this spurred and began this debate around psychotherapy effectiveness and sort of which therapy is best and such, right? So it makes sense to me that Scott would start from this position, as everyone does, right? Like there wasn't really a debate, or at least the debate wasn't solidified, until this research came out. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah, the field was already, I'm thinking back to, the field was already rocked by the dodo bird verdict that, yes, psychotherapy modalities or theories were roughly equivalent, a lot of that by Bruce Wampold. And then it was kind of like a 1-2 punch when Scott Miller was suggesting, okay, well, what matters, of course, again, Wampold was saying the relationship, and that most therapists actually do pretty poorly. It was hard. I remember people in the audience being quite angry, right? And that's the whole thing is is the people that are so convinced that they're doing so well. I'm a great therapist. They're not often asking clients enough. Their clients may have a different view. I'm sure we have run into therapists like this. I'm sure we've seen advertisements, of therapists that, they might be even making okay money, but they could be a revolving door. There's issues with the outcomes that they're producing, and just, the level of relationship that they're able to maintain with clients long lasting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting engaging with Scott's research and positionings to see how poor of a picture the research paints for the average clinician. Like, that actually, like certainly he makes reference to the idea that psychotherapy is effective. Like research demonstrates that
and we want to remember that.
Yeah, psychotherapy is up there alongside
Absolutely.
medical treatments and its effectiveness, for a variety of challenges. So he's not saying that it's not effective, but certainly it's not particularly complementary to any individual clinician or clinicians in general. Like, we can do better. There's a wide gap in terms of how effective we are versus how effective we could be, right? There's certainly room for improvement.
Everybody wants to think of themselves as a super shrink, but that's not true. There's just such a small percentage that really are getting this disproportionate level of good outcome, like really extreme outcomes.
Sure. I think I agree with Scott, though. Like, to me, it makes sense, the idea that modality doesn't necessarily make a difference. Like, I'm sort of the mind. I think, like, we've made reference to this a little bit before, and I'm increasingly troubled by the modal way that we approach psychotherapy. There's often this notion of different modalities own different ways of practicing. And, we've talked about the common factors and, the idea that there's so many commonalities amongst therapies. There aren't really, 450 or 480 or 520 or whatever there are now distinct approaches to psychotherapy. There's really just a handful.
Yeah.
And there's a finite way that we engage with patients and interpret what they say and intervene within their experience, right? And it's a little bit silly to punctuate or emphasize modality, I think. And I think Scott, Bruce, a lot of these researchers, they're trying to emphasize that there's sort of a non-modal skill set that we ought to be approaching instead, so I like that. But I think, it is important to make reference to one of the previous contributors to the Great Psychotherapy Debate that we made reference to, Jonathan Shedler. I think his critical stance in effectiveness research was really, really helpful. He really called into question a lot of the research that looks at effectiveness, precisely because it's often done over a short term. So, if the conclusion is that all therapies are equivalent in their effectiveness, but the study was only done over 8 to 16 sessions, or that, is it really saying that, all therapies are equally effective, or is it saying that all therapies are equally ineffective when when done over the course of 8 to 16 sessions, right? And, does outcome change? And, there's a case to be made that outcomes do change with time to a degree, right? I think Scott made reference to research that sort of runs counter to that in some ways, like more time is not necessarily better, but, for some stances in psychotherapy, there is the idea that time is essential, right? And certainly there's probably too little time, right? So there's that idea, right? Like how this research was conducted, whether or not it accounted for time frame, whether or not it allowed certain approaches to psychotherapy to sort of fully manifest or captured them appropriately. But then I think there's also just the question of outcome and how outcome is assessed, right? How effectiveness is assessed, right? And I know that Scott sort of privileges or tends to take the position of outcome measures associated with symptom reduction. And that's also a stance that we've been kind of critical of. When we look only at the reduction of symptoms on a scale, we sort of miss the meaning or the specificity of the encounter with the therapist, and we don't necessarily capture something of the client's true experience. And the case can be made that sometimes symptoms are not symptoms at all; they're actually something very essential to a person's life, and so their removal is not actually ideal. So I say all that just to say that there are some critical points in this stance, but I generally agree with this position that emphasizing modality is not helpful. It creates this sort of siloing, and we fight. God, do we fight, Richard? Do we fight with each other, and we don't, and we get all defensive and guarded, and we don't see eye to eye, and I don't think that helps anyone. So
What I think was really revolutionary or a great contribution that Scott has made is really the ability, to ask the client, how good is their therapist really at helping them? And I think it would be important for listeners to look at the outcome rating scale, the session rating scale, to understand, this doesn't look like something like the Beck Depression Inventory. It is a scale, where a client can put kind of by freehand where they want along this line. But that goes from everything to, did my therapist really help me achieve, my goals today as I defined it, as the client? Did I feel like I was safe? Can I trust them? I think these are important things. Yes. Talks about, how is the functioning in my family, school? How do I think, these areas have improved? But it's important to note too, and I was doing a little bit more research in between this episode and having some good conversations with other people. And a lot of this is built off of Tim Anderson's work. And I know Wampold also cites this in his podcast. And Tim Anderson's work from University of Wisconsin at Madison talks about the facilitative interpersonal skills, or FIS. And so it's really looking at, is the therapist helping me reach my goals? Do I trust them? It's all about alliance. It's all about their ability to deal with challenging clients. So if the client is angry, what is the ability of the therapist to actually be able to kind of hold space in that area, right? There's some interesting research by a Canadian company, Skillsetter, that has Dr. Wampold on as their chief scientist. And that is helping train therapists in that direction to be better at these kind of what we would probably say micro skills as therapists.
yeah, no, I mean, we're going to get into the feedback and feedback informed therapy, right? And the way that Scott constructs it. And you're right, it's not as reductive as maybe the research, like just kind of psychological research in the wild, right? Which tends to work around these constructions of a psychological disorder and understand effectiveness in terms, or outcome effectiveness in terms of symptom reduction. So that's fair. But I just make reference to it as a critical point. Just because he does occasionally go, yeah, psychological disorders, yeah, symptom reduction. Like he is, in some ways, he's taking that
he
stance,
still does
right?
that. As Wampold does as well. That's kind of that mainstream dominant narrative, and that is, my sense is he is a very applied researcher. That is still the language, right? That in the States, right, which funds the majority of large clinical trials, the National Institute of Mental Health, you have to communicate in that language. My impression of Scott Miller as a person, and when you have a closer conversation with him, and I think with Wampold, there's been some moments where he's been pretty vulnerable as well. There's sometimes, is that code switching. There's one way you have to talk to, maybe the general public or funders, or create a research study that's going to actually be approved. And there's another way that, I think he speaks to therapists. And even in the training, I was quite struck with just really trying to understand, like, help us with our
Yeah,
plight
yeah.
as therapists. No, but you're right. I guess that's the box that we are often constrained in. And, our podcast is based on trying to examine that box in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't really think that Scott, and we could lump Bruce into that too.
Yeah.
They're so close in so many of their positions,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't really think either of them are staunchly medical in their perspective on human distress or the sort of the problems that are encountered in therapy, right? But it frustrates me that they continue
Mm-hmm.
to kind of capitulate to that understanding in some ways, and like
That's fair. Yeah.
because of the implications in it, right? Like, and it
Yeah.
changes, like there's something,
Yeah.
it fundamentally changes the way that we approach therapy when we no longer construct distress in the context of disorders, right? Like when we think about it differently.
Yeah.
And so, and it's not clear to me how they
Mm-hmm.
understand problems, right? They're not
Mm.
necessarily explicitly taking a medical position, but they keep making reference to it. This is just sort of a gripe and an
Mm-hmm.
aside for me, though, Richard. Like, I don't necessarily think it's a hugely critical point in Scott's direction, right? Like, I think
No.
it doesn't change, but we often make reference to the kind of social construction of psychotherapy, right, and of human suffering as having a bearing in how we engage with and how we support our clients with
Mm-hmm.
challenges, right? So, I mean, it's worth mentioning, like, if there are implications to treating distress as a health problem, right? And so I don't know that they're necessarily, I don't know if they've deconstructed that in their own positioning, I guess. Yeah. But I think, just to come back to sort
Mm-hmm.
of this first point, okay, so this is where Scott's starting, okay? He's starting at this level of the effectiveness amongst, psychotherapy modalities being equivalent. And he's humbled by that. And so that's really struck him. He's not raging against that. He's not still fighting on behalf of a particular modality. However we feel about that, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we all have to digest that position or that research in some ways, right? You've made reference to this concept already. Is super shrinks like the next point that tends to
Mm.
be reiterated when Scott talks or when Scott writes is that some therapists really do seem to be a lot better at creating good outcomes with their clients than others. And so even though modality doesn't provide a good explanation for effectiveness, there are certainly differences in effectiveness between individual therapists. Scott is referencing research that was originally conducted, I think, at a children's hospital or a clinic in the United States somewhere in the 70s, I think, or the 70s or the 80s. They did like longitudinal research following, child clients of this clinic and measuring outcomes after a long time. And one of the things that they found within their body of research was that there was a clinician that really stood out at this clinic. The outcome for his or her clients was consistently better than their colleagues. And so the researchers dubbed this clinician a super shrink. And this is a
Mm.
concept that Scott Miller's run with, is that there are some of us that just seem to be really, 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 really good at what we do. So while modality doesn't explain our effectiveness all that well, there is still something that does. Like, there is still a factor somehow. Somehow we can be effective. We can be very effective. And so I think this is the direction that Scott's going, is trying to understand what it is that makes therapists effective, those individual therapists effective.
I think that's a good summary, Glenn. Yes.
Yeah. So, like, what do you think about this, Richard? This idea of super shrinks?
Yeah. Definitely. Anecdotally or in my own experience, I have met both therapists and non-therapists, cultural workers, foster parents in some cases, others that just were head and shoulders above others, right? In terms of their ability to connect with clients, their ability to maintain long-term relationships with clients, how well and how quickly the clients improved, even from kind of being on the precipice, so in some very extreme and challenging situations. And yeah, I don't think it's just owned by therapists, but yeah, I think there is people that are super shrinks, and it comes down to this relationality and this ability to build alliance. And alliance is not only trust, and we'll talk more about
Yeah,
that
yeah.
unless this is the time to talk.
I think that the term that Scott uses is engagement, and
Engagement is the other piece. Yeah,
we both found that interesting, trying to
engagement.
digest what that meant. But he's consistently used the concept of engagement
Hmm.
throughout his speaking and his writing. Yeah,
Yeah, I like that
as
term actually.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a good term because it sort of speaks to the idea. I mean, he's saying that it's what's connected to effectiveness. So he's saying it's what accounts
Hmm.
for effectiveness. And so we can take something from engagement, the idea of being engaged. Like engagement speaks to kind of presence. It speaks to an active component on the therapist part of to be engaged means you have to kind of try. You're searching for the client. You're trying to reach them. You're trying to connect, to grip the client in some ways, right? So it's interesting, but it's a little bit nebulous, just in like it's not operationally defined, obviously, but it's not 100% clear what Scott means by engagement. Like the engagement is sort of a broad term where there's room for some interpretation. So I think both of us were also asking, like, what does it mean? Like, what is
Yeah.
engagement? Like, what is he really getting at when he says engagement, right? But it's interesting, it is interesting. I mean, I'm with you. Like, I think, obviously, like, there's just some people who are just naturally, gifted to the work, right? And we've encountered those too, or I've encountered those too. People that are really prone to this and people that are not. This is a fruitful direction to go. Do I have a critical point around this? No, I think this is one of the pieces of Scott's reasoning that I'm most excited about. I don't have too much criticism about this.
Hmm.
I think it makes a lot of
Uh-huh.
sense. I think this is a really fruitful direction to go. Like again, I'm not a huge proponent of thinking about things modally. To me,
Uh-huh.
I think that this is the right direction to go. That we think about things relationally, and I mean,
Uh-huh.
that I privilege relational orientations that focus on, we might say the concept of engagement, right? Like that emphasize and
Uh-huh.
punctuate the therapist's capacity to engage or engaging the client, working with them at the relational level. I mean, I don't know, like, this is where I get kind of tripped up by Scott. Like, I don't know that Scott is a psychodynamic therapist, so I don't know that he's thinking about
No,
relationality specifically in the way that psychodynamic therapists do. So I can't necessarily
probably not.
lump him into that group, but there's got to be some commonality. Like, I think that he nonetheless approaches, like, he's not afraid to, or he invites therapists to approach, the emotionality of the patient or the client and to engage them around that. Like, he is still asking or supporting therapists to sort of lean into difficult encounters. So I mean, again, there, like, if we don't think about it modally, like, there's got to be some commonalities, some common space between,
Mhm.
like, relationally oriented psychodynamic orientations and what Scott's saying here, I think, right? So
I know Scott Miller and Bruce, they're talking a lot about, like, of course, with common factors, right? They would see one modality might call, a client exhibiting some difficult behavior, right? That is maybe blocking them
yeah.
from progress, right? As a defense mechanism, right? From psychoanalysis or more psychodynamic kind of understandings. And another person, would see this as, motivational interviewing would say that this is ambivalence, right? So, but we're hitting on common things, right? I don't
Mhm.
think we're looking at what's in common. We're using maybe different terms for
Yeah.
actually what are similar concepts. Engagement, and again, I think I would love to ask Scott more about what he defines in engagement, but some of the
Yeah.
things that I came across were this idea of really it's also how engagement is measured is also really by the client too, right? Is the
Mhm.
client showing up? Right. He talks a lot about that, about retention rate, their attendance, right? Both the eye contact that the therapist is giving, the posture, the engagement of both people. But really, he turns it towards the client, right? So it's like a microscope, on the client. So even kind of engagement, is the therapist, an engaged therapist is really that's determined by how engaged the client is,
Right, right.
right? So it's an
You're saying,
interesting
yeah,
view.
yeah,
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 yeah. You're saying engagement is really about the client in some ways too, which, yeah, makes sense, right? Because I
yeah.
think, we just from experience, I can appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, there's not much that I can do when a client is not actually particularly interested in experiencing anything in the session with me, right? When they're not invested in their own development learning or understanding or whatever, right? So yeah. Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
it's yeah, I mean, I like what you said too about just the commonalities. You're so right. Like there's so like how often are we reconstructing the same concepts in different language in psychotherapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we can just think about the numerous authors who have, written about the same thing as though it's different, right? Or just
Mm-hmm.
they just use different words. There are finite limits to human experience and what happens for people and what's possible in therapy, right? Which, I mean, they're big limits, like they're wide limits, like there's room for a lot. Like I'm not suggesting that, that it's a relatively small space that's simple and easily captured, but I am just saying that like it's not infinitely reproducible. Like we might come up with this idea that it's a never-ending mystery, right? And I think that that's not quite the case. Like I think that over time we have developed an understanding of what does help people, right? Or what can help people, depending on their aims or goals or needs. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm contradicting myself in saying this now because it's like I want to leave room for that to be open, but what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that we don't need 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 modalities. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
not like I think there might be some people that are of this mind that the proliferation of
No.
approaches is really good and like it speaks to a kind of novel, like a kind of innovation, and I think that's
Yeah.
probably not the case. Like I think more often than not it's not innovation, it's like renovation. It's
Yeah.
rehashing an old concept.
Well, it's interesting. I came across, just to add some heat to this debate, I
Yeah,
came across just different debates kind of online and on Reddit suggesting, based on some of research by, again, Timothy Anderson. He's now at, actually, I think, Ohio University, and talking about the facilitative interpersonal skills and micro skills and other things like this. And they were saying, like, well, maybe we shouldn't be teaching theory at all. Maybe that's
right.
really a distraction from what is actually helping clients get better, which seems to be these, again, people get so locked into their particular school of thoughts when actually it's about there's particular skills that we know can help build empathy. We can help build confidence within the client. We can help them, self-reflect. There's these important facilitative interpersonal skills, and how that looks, or again, the wording differs from theory to theory. Is our theory and ourselves, are we hitting on that or not? And how we can tell in many ways is the feedback our
Yeah.
clients are giving us,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there is something powerful in that um, idea of feedback. It's saying that the relationship with the client matters most. I mean, I think when you say, like, when you reference Tim Anderson's sort of question around
Mm-hmm.
whether or not their theory should even be taught, I think maybe like what you're speaking to is the fact that sometimes we use theory as a replacement for our understanding of the client. Like we use it as a substitute. So rather than trying to understand the client, which might be an expression of Scott Miller's engagement, right? And which involves like a lot of work on our part to really like
Mm-hmm.
ask good questions and construct an understanding with the client of what's going on for them. Instead, we have this understanding pre-built with us within the theory. We already know what problems are because the theory tells us that. So we don't really need to understand this client. We can just work from this understanding of theory and this theoretical understanding of their problem and sort of offer them that, right? And work from that direction. And I think that, to me, that's really problematic, right? That would be the pitfall of theory, right? With theory in the service of understanding is something entirely different, though, I think. Like theory that supports our work of understanding people, and that, to me, that's different than a theory which is sort of offered as a replacement for an understanding, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand maybe expand on that a little bit. A replacement for understanding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So, like, we always, we're going to dunk on cognitive behavioral therapy here. It's a big
Sure.
boy; it can take it, right? But I mean, it offers a way of thinking about problems, right? It offers a kind of framework of the human experience, the cognitive behavioral triangle, if you will, right? Thoughts, feelings, behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and their interrelationship through operant conditioning, the mechanisms of operant conditioning. There's a kind of novel concept now, which is like it's about problem maintaining circles. That's what it is, right? That's like a sort of novel
Mm-hmm.
concept, right? There's this idea then that we can understand people's problems through this lens, this framework, right? And so
Yeah.
maybe the problem in this theory is that in some ways it could be a substitute to us really listening to the client and trying to understand things from their perspective. Like we could kind of start from the perspective that when a client starts to say, they're depressed, that there's a kind of problem maintaining circle. We can rely upon this sort of model, the cognitive behavioral therapy model, to construct our understanding. And in doing so, we can miss important information from the client that accounts for or helps us and helps them to understand what's going on for them, right? And so I'm saying that sometimes theory is in the service of itself, right? Theory is in the service of constructing an understanding for us so that we don't have to do that work. But I think that I'm saying that, like, there is also theory that supports the work of constructing an understanding. Like when you think about the constructivist schools of thought in, humanistic, like narrative therapy or psychoanalysis, like the whole point of that is they're saying like the therapy is done out of a co-constructed like intersubjective process with the client, right? So they're saying we can't, like, the theory isn't sort of starting with an understanding of what it means to be a human. It's more theory about how we understand people and about the process of constructing an understanding, right? I don't know if I made that any clearer, Richard.
No, I don't know.
Maybe more convoluted. Yeah.
Some of the research does show that therapists with a theory do better than those without. There's something to be said about having at least some immersion in a theory and a confidence, right? So that's one of the factors that is connected to good outcomes, according to Wampold. So it is one way of understanding the world. One thing that I talk to students a lot about is thinking like a scientist, so that we have a hypothesis and we are holding a model tentatively. We do this in case conceptualizations. Case conceptualization is a very good skill to have, really understanding, okay, so they have these symptoms. Why do they have these symptoms? What is the etiology of these symptoms? And you do need theory in some way, really, to be able to understand. But I think the problem is kind of, as you're saying, is sticking to one theory, one explanation too tightly, having it as a base, as a start, and being able to let go of it as new data emerges is a sign of a good critical thinker and a good therapist.
Yeah. I think that's well said, Richard, and is, I think, close enough to the point that I'm trying to make.
We'll check Glenn for signs of heat stroke as we go along.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And we should go along because there's many more points to cover, so we should keep going. But I think that's really good. And super shrinks is really good, right? So I think that's really interesting. But when we get to point 3 now, which you made reference to as sort of Scott's entrance in some ways into the debate, the magic, right? And Scott himself has done research with psychics, mediums, and mentalists, and he's found, very interestingly, that they sometimes outperform therapists in terms of effectiveness. This is a very controversial, very, very interesting conclusion that he's come to in the research. So I think we've got to spend a little bit of time with this. And it's something that he reiterates a lot. Like, it's an important point for him. I think he's saying it. He's speaking to engagement. Like, it's so interesting to me that he's like, Scott's so funny because he's he's out there, right? He's out there, he's meeting with people and he's engaging. He's asking these psychics. He's researching these psychics and stuff. And it's like he's talked about his own experiences. He talked about his own experience meeting with a medium, and he said he had the most uncanny experience. Where it really felt like they were reading his mind, like they really understood, before he even understood, they saw something and they sort of understood why he was there. Yeah. So it's funny that he has that experience, but then he says, or he's kind of like, the conclusion he has to draw in some way is, well, we would see these people as effective because they're so engaging. They're very persuasive and they're quite charismatic. They embody a lot of these capacities of an engaging therapist in their own unique way. And so that's what accounts for the effectiveness. So I just think that it's interesting. There's a little bit of a contradiction in Scott's own experience and maybe the conclusions that he draws. Maybe not, right? I mean, he's probably recognized this contradiction himself, but it's sort of like, in some ways we could argue that his research concludes that maybe there are psychics and there are mediums and they're real and they're really good at what they do, right? Versus drawing the conclusion that it's engagement alone. But anyway, that's kind of, I want to hear your thoughts, that we could talk more about it. Like, it's an interesting point though. Yeah.
Well, he also, as he's talked about this before, saying that their level of empathy was just really incredible. Like people felt very taken care of as he was talking to people who have seen psychics as well, and getting their experiences. So a lot of qualitative interviews that they would, the psychics seem to be picking up on extremely subtle body language that others, even experienced therapists, might not pick up on. There is some, and I can't remember where I saw this, but I know that there's some research in our attachment literature kind of in general, that people that are coming from so children that were raised in these abusive environments, and then later on, they become a lot more sensitive to subtle cues, right, that are signs of threat or danger, right? So it's interesting that there's a good proportion of these super shrinks, a good proportion of these people that seem to be incredibly attuned that have had histories like that. Doesn't explain everything about
Mm-hmm.
that. Like we'll talk about
Mm-hmm.
deliberate practice and other things that make up a super shrink, but that is
Mm.
an interesting life history factor,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, those
right?
are
They
all
were
good
trained
points.
very
Yeah,
young in a sense, right? Their
yeah, yeah,
environment
yeah,
trained
yeah.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, those are all reasonable accounts. And I think there is
Mm-hmm.
something kind of neat about this research and its conclusions, because again, it kind of like it brings us down to our knees a little bit. It humbles us. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
such an emphasis on the scientific project of psychotherapy, right? Or the scientific sort of stance of psychotherapy. And so to have these, what are considered pseudoscientific practitioners perform better kind of shows that like pursuing like a manualized protocol, like trying
Mm-hmm.
to capture the essence of psychotherapy through a ritualized process, if you will, or a rigorous process, is not necessarily the direction forward. Like there's something that these psychics have, obviously, that some therapists
However,
don't. Yeah.
However, they are following rituals. That is something else that's
Sure,
been
sure, sure.
identified, right?
Yeah.
They're
No,
following sometimes in a very specific order. Yeah,
yeah,
it's not, you're right.
sure.
That's what's so
Okay. Yeah, yeah,
interesting, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not science. Like
yeah,
we don't consider them, in this scientific realm, but there is, a method to their madness. Is very interesting, right?
yeah,
Their processes that they're using, the statements, the order of that they do things to create this, engagement, right? People can
yeah,
be,
yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting.
Okay, that's interesting you say that, right? So you're saying
Mm-hmm.
in some ways it can be a little bit manualized, yeah. I mean, it's funny.
Yeah.
I think about like when I was a teenager,
Mm-hmm.
I remember I got my tarot cards read a couple of times or something, and I went to the same guy both times. He was here
Mm-hmm.
in Victoria actually. His
Mm-hmm.
name, I'll never forget. His name was Lion Sun. That was his name.
Mm-hmm.
And he really was like a lion of a guy. Like he was sort of, he had this big head of
Mm-hmm.
hair and a beard, and he looked like a lion.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, he read my tarot cards a couple of times, and it was very interesting. But I remember leaving him after the second time and feeling that it was generic because there was so much that felt similar to the
Mm-hmm.
first time that he did it. Like it felt like he really was just sort of offering me a scripted response, and so it felt
Mm-hmm.
less impactful than the first time. Well, when it really did feel like a little bit like he was reading my mind, and reading my future, reading me in some
Mm-hmm.
ways. So yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot to this. I love that Scott punctuates this point, like that he makes a point of emphasizing this. I don't necessarily think, although I did watch a talk with him on one podcast. I forget what it was, and I mean, Scott's into tarot now. He's reading people's tarot cards. He was saying
Mm-hmm.
that, he's sort of out there a little bit more. He's been touched by these experiences for sure, and it's opened his mind, and I think that's really interesting. To me, he's doing two things. He's punctuating that there's something more than just our scientific understanding of psychotherapy, which informs or needs to inform
Mm-hmm.
our understanding of effectiveness. He's trying to speak to, again, this interpersonal quality, but I think he is also playing with the uncanny in this, like he's saying there's
Mm-hmm.
something uncanny in these experiences that these psychics, these mediums and mentalists have. And I think he's open to that. So to me, there's sort of two landing points within this point, or two conclusions you can draw. But I think it leads well to the fourth point, which is a point he shares with Bruce Wampold. And that is, like, this research has really led him to believe that technique and orientation matter much less than our capacity to be interpersonally engaging, persuasive, and work within the endogenous worldview and framework of the client. So I think that the conclusions that he's ultimately drawn and that he sort of spells out to people, the uncanny aside, what he's been talking about
Mm-hmm.
with tarot cards and his experience with the medium aside, is like he's concluded that these these mediums, these psychics, mentalists, they're very engaging people. They're very persuasive. They work well within the framework of the client. Like they offer something they operate within the endogenous worldview of the client. And that these are keys to effective therapies. These might account for the effectiveness of these therapists. So that's the direction that he goes following this research. Right away I can say I agree. I agree, Richard. I mean, this goes back to my previous point. Like I'm kind of right there with him. Like I think that the constructivist schools of psychotherapy are founded on this idea, right? That we don't want to replace our understanding of the client's experience through our own understanding of and fidelity to a theory. We need to kind of build from the ground up with the client an understanding of what's happening for them. And we do that through the language of the client's own experience. And we do that by divesting ourselves of an orientation in some ways, by trying not to come to the sessions with a sort of prepackaged understanding of what's going on. I mean, I'm kind of 100% with Scott on this already, right? I don't know what you think, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I do think, there's a point here that you said, was this research, conducted over 1 to 3 or 3 to 6 sessions, etc. It's interesting, there's people will talk about, I've had clients talk about this, going to a psychic, right? Or going to someone, and in that conversation, changes the course of their life. There's some research. I had a graduate student help me doing some research, shout out to Sparsh Sharma, and he was talking about the whole area of spontaneous recovery, that when there's a certain people are in a certain state, maybe there's a culmination of events, there's a life transition moment, perhaps spiritually, psychologically open enough that there can be these singular events, whether it's a conversation with a therapist, a psychic, a relative, a psychedelic experience, another type of spiritual experience, where people will stop cold turkey, right? Their addiction or anxiety is just, goes rapidly down, and it actually can stay that way for quite a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's so interesting for me to think, and maybe this is a tangent, but how potentially one conversation from somebody, I think, who is, this really engaged therapist, but maybe, engaged is not enough of a description of all of the factors that a therapist like this or a healer like this would have, but that can change, that one experience can change a person's life.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, you're referencing the uncanny again, right? Which is interesting, and I'm not closed to that, right? You and I have an open mind to that, right? Like that's part of the interest and stance that we have is we don't really understand, right? We need to be open to something beyond our understanding that could account for people's experience. So yes, but yeah, I mean, to the point of engagement, like to the point of like, do you believe or do you agree with him that the appropriate conclusion to draw from this research is that what makes people effective in general is this persuasive, engaging, charismatic capacity to really reach someone, to really, I don't know, to understand them, to sort of capture them in some way interpersonally.
And I think they ask. I think
Yeah.
that's what was shown also, was that these therapists ask the client. They ask a lot. They seek feedback a lot, was one of the keys to super shrinks, as well as even, these hypnotists, these others. They're asking some very particular questions, right? That's an interesting thing to me. They're seeking feedback in a variety of ways, right? The data in front of them of the client, how are they reacting to the question, their body language, right? That's a type of data, as well as verbally asking, right? And I train my supervisees in that way, is that, you're coming to me as a supervisor saying, well, am I doing a good job? Your clients will let you know. And this is how you can know, is the person in front of you, right? Are they opening up more, or are they, closing down? Are they continuing sessions like that? Yeah, that's what truly listening to our client is, right? Maybe the definition of engagement, I think it will expand over time as we understand it more and as there's more studies. And again, I think engagement is one concept. It's not going to fully capture this phenomenon of super shrinks, but it was something that could be, right? Because we are in the world of science that can be measured more. Whereas these other things like the uncanny or these other extra, what are often called extra therapeutic factors, are harder to measure. Not necessarily impossible, but a lot harder to measure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
at least at
Yeah,
this time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and I mean, I think I do have a sort of critical stance on all of this, which
Mhm.
I think is that like I get curious, like again, I do get curious a little bit about the research, like you made reference to, like, was it just a single session with the mentalist or the medium or the psychic, or how much did they meet? And just because the subjective experience of the client after meeting the medium or the psychic was better than before meeting them,
Mhm.
does that mean that there's some meaningful, long-lasting outcome that's come from this experience, right? Or was it just that
Yeah, and I don't
something
think
in this?
Scott was looking at that so
Yeah,
much.
yeah,
Yeah, I think your
yeah,
argument is valid in that
yeah,
sense
yeah,
that there is research on this idea of spontaneous recovery, which is not discussed here, that is
yeah,
looking at
yeah,
follow-up 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5, 10 years, right? Like
yeah,
looking
yeah,
over a lifetime potentially,
yeah,
and across cultures, etc., and stratified kind of samples. But that's the question, right? Like, so on the outcome rating scale, okay, so did my client, or session rating scale, did my therapist help me reach my goal? Okay, yes. And hopefully again we're asking for that again and again. I think both you and I would probably argue that for lasting change to happen, that it's going to take time, right?
yeah,
Feeling okay, so I feel good about my therapist, feel like I'm generally approaching reaching my goals. Well, as you pointed out, and I think that was a great point, and Jonathan Shedler pointed out in that previous podcast we did, are the ways that we look at change in 1, 2, 3 sessions, or even a few months, right, are very different than how we should look at change in long-term psychotherapy, kind of like this identity level change that can occur, right? Like a mindset
yeah, yeah,
change, a very different type of change,
yeah.
right? That often clinical trials and other research don't have that kind of follow up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and
Mm.
I sort of read into Scott, probably from maybe from his brief solution focused, origins in
Yeah.
some ways, and Bruce to a degree
Hmm.
too, because again, they're very similar in their positioning. Like this sort of this tendency to understand psychotherapy, or at least effectiveness in psychotherapy, as
Mm.
the client feels better after they saw the therapist. Something in the session happened and they feel sort of better,
Mm.
right? And so there's this idea that what matters is that people just sort of feel happier after they've seen their therapist, right? Worked with their therapist, right? And again, I don't know, like I don't want to, straw man Scott and Bruce, right? Or misrepresent them here, right? But I just get the sense that like they're not necessarily understanding psychotherapy. I mean, I could be very wrong here, right? But like the way they talk about it from the research perspective is that they're not really necessarily looking at psychotherapy as something confronting, something that would involve
Mm.
discomfort, something that might have the client feeling worse before they feel better for some time, right? When you think about psychological work, and I mean, this is just my continued experience with
Yeah.
things that I'm speaking about, right? But it's like oftentimes, like we've talked about this, oftentimes, like what is most helpful for people is also kind of most painful, right? Like we spoke about this in our trauma episode, in the last episode, right? Like trauma therapy is it's kind of about helping the client to suffer what they feel they cannot suffer, right? To feel or to hurt in the way they feel they could not be hurt, right? So I do wonder, like with these mediums, these mentalists, these
Mm.
psychics, like was there any actual penetration of the client's existing
Mm.
defenses into something more real, or was it the opposite, where was the client sort of reaffirmed in their defenses? And like certainly the client would maybe, like if they're reaffirmed in their defenses, they would maybe say, oh, I feel a lot better after. It was very nice to meet this person. I found them very helpful. I feel so good. But they're not necessarily better off, like by some measures at least, right? By some stances in psychotherapy, we would not necessarily see them as better off than they were before. So again, there's sort of this embedded in this, I'm reading into it, at least embedded in this, is this sense of, we just privilege the positive experiences. There's this sort of positive orientation which is sort of permeating this research. Like did these psychics and mediums, did the experience have a penetrating quality which captured something in the person to create lasting change, or did they just have a nice time, and maybe a nicer time than they would have had with a therapist, right? And so that's the conclusion. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I mean Scott. So I mean Scott does make the point like he's against this idea that, and this is part of this conclusion. He's against this idea of the therapist cultivating an objective psychotherapy practice rooted in a materialist reality. He's saying that's rarely helpful to people. I would agree. And so he's at least getting out of this idea that we're delivering something real, like the therapist somehow has a more real understanding of what's going on. But maybe I'll just say like, yeah, so I think there's some nuance here, right? Like it's not so easy. I wish we had Scott here to sort of talk to him more about that research and get his thoughts on these critical points, right? Because I don't know what he would say, but I mean, I can see his point, right? Like maybe he had some people meet with the psychics and the same people meet with the therapists and sort of rate their experiences or, provide some feedback. And, there's this sort of interesting conclusion that the psychics did better. So he's got to try to account for that, right? And I think that, like we said, I do think there's still something to this concept of engagement to work with. Let's keep going. There's a couple more points that we really want to punctuate here. The next one, which he loves to make reference to, is that research actually shows that therapists get worse over time, not better. I think that's really, really interesting. Why I think that is interesting is because Linda O'Neill in my program, she said that there was research that showed that therapists, they sort of max out in their effectiveness at the age of 56. So she's sort of arguing that therapists get better over time and that we all peak around 56. At least that was the average sort of peak age. So I learned
this
something.
This is what's interesting, Glenn,
Yeah.
is again, this other researcher, Tim Anderson, on facilitative interpersonal skills, is that experience does not make a difference. So it's possible that someone with just a few years of experience as a therapist could be getting the same outcomes as somebody who has 10 or 12 years, but differently. Age makes a difference. So there's something to be said about the life experience, perhaps the life experience outside of therapy, just the wisdom that can be accrued over age. That age does tend to make better therapists. I could anecdotally speak to this when I've had supervisees and students that are mature students, right? Maybe they've had their own experience of recovery. Maybe they've done other jobs in tech engineering. They were nurses, whatever, right? But something about the age, I thought that was very interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's like I'm not specifically sure what research Scott is referencing. I do believe that he's referencing research that was done and that is valid. Like I'm not.
I think he's referencing Tim Anderson's research because Tim Anderson's research was looking at what are the different factors that lead to therapist effectiveness. So he's looking at many different factors. So everything from age to gender to theory to whether they were at a psychologist level or whether they were a graduate or undergraduate level. So looking at a number of different factors to see, do those make a difference in outcomes?
Yeah. And so, I mean, and like, the case he makes around this, I think makes a lot of sense to me. Like he's saying that the typical therapist development process is, it's sort of weekend workshops and it's clinical supervision, right? And neither of these things are associated in the research with effectiveness. So, but yet we do both so consistently.
Let's just pause for a second. How controversial that is. Our entire industry is its lifeblood is built off of having always the newest training. Yeah. And we always say get more supervision. Now, again, the training of that is often not happening would be the training in these kinds of common factor, facilitative, interpersonal skills of improving the relationality, as well as supervision that's focusing on how the therapist is getting in the client's way. Are they improving in feedback? Supervision focused in deliberate practice can improve. But I would say, I don't know what the stat is, but the majority is of supervision. The majority of training is not like that. It is a fight over turf, and my theory is better than your theory. And this is like a whoa moment.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not going to fight this. Even the idea of supervision, just because I know that, what so much supervision in our day and era is primarily administrative, right? Like there's
Yes.
or
That's it.
like who knows, right? Like
It's
it's
over
sort of
focused on,
yeah,
yes, the liability risk point, and also on two, or
yeah, yeah.
theoretical, to
Yeah, yeah,
focus
I was gonna
on the
say, yeah,
theory.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. That's right.
exactly.
That it's primarily about sort of
Mm-hmm.
coaching a theoretical stance.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So there's
Mm-hmm.
not. I mean, it's sort of a bit of a rarity to find a supervision that again would sort of emphasize what you were speaking about, these sort of interpersonal skills and the
It
sort
was
of
so
feedback
good to
reform.
read this. Myself as a
Yeah,
supervisor, I was struck by this,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
I do really try to, in more recent years, year or so, like really try to grab onto the common factors and look at these skills that are common across modality to improve therapists and non-therapists alike. But still, it's very easy to get, I still have some programming in particular theories, and that's what supervisees are often asking for. So it's hard to completely separate from that. But I thought his research was a very good reminder to me of like, okay, how can I continue to develop in this, yeah,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
position? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's controversial. Like that's like most
Mm-hmm.
of Scott's positions, right? Like it flies in the face of the status quo, right? But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like I think I don't really do weekend workshops now. Like I'm not big, like we've talked about. I'm not big into this sort of eclectic fashion of approaching psychotherapy. I'm more oriented psychodynamically and
Mm-hmm.
critically, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's important actually to not fill my head with a bunch of the latest tips and tricks and things like that. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the workshops I have been to, like it's easy to get enamored by the idea, or like you see, the clinic or the instructors will always show sort of best case scenarios of their modality working, and you can be quite impressed and go, oh, that's so good and stuff. And then you go and try to do it with your own clients, of course, and fall flat on your face or whatever, right? And so like he is speaking to something that I think happens for
Yeah,
so many of us so often, right?
absolutely.
And it's because we're sort of putting the
Yeah.
cart before the horse, so to speak, or we're getting lost in this modal, this modal way of engaging in the work. Yeah,
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 and it can be counterintuitive, but like again, this fits this idea of deliberate practice. Is the research and supervision
yeah,
is showing that supervisors that focus on describing mistakes that they've made, so they have a vulnerability, and this is often talked about in this idea of like a trauma-informed supervision.
yeah,
So they're making mistakes, they're describing all how these ethical problems happened, and looking for examples within themselves and within their supervisees, and encouraging this culture of like fail fast, fail often, fail early, right?
yeah,
So asking their bring in, and I ask my supervisees, I know this is vulnerable, so once they have enough trust with me, let's look at something that you feel was done just really poorly. Let's look at like your worst moment, and we will laugh and cry and
yeah,
work
yeah,
to support you in
yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
So to create a safe container for improvement is so important.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Yeah, we have to fail and we have to be
Mm-hmm.
supported in our failure, and we will fail. And I mean that there's no way around that, right? This work is too complex
Mm-hmm.
and too difficult to just get right easily and quickly. So I agree. But yeah, I mean it's a good point, and it's the point that sort of leads Scott to his sort of his next point, which is deliberate
Mm-hmm.
practice, sort of being the way forward, right? So, the conclusion that he draws from this and from everything that led up to his, ideas around interpersonal engagement being the main way to account for clinician effectiveness is the idea of deliberate practice. He's saying we can practice engagement, we can practice. So he's referencing Anders Ericsson. Who was Anders Ericsson again?
He's a Swedish psychologist.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. He was foundational in this understanding of deliberate practice as a way to foster excellence. So I think one of the common examples that's cited is chess, like if you look at what it takes to become a chess grandmaster, it involves not just playing chess, consistently, right? But it involves sitting down and working through problems and practicing specific positions and learning opening theory and practicing that, and deliberately looking at areas of the game where you're struggling and working with a coach. And so this whole idea of deliberate practice, like is easily illustrated in the world of, say, chess or sports or something like that, right? But it's the idea of picking a particular skill that's associated with your work and deliberately practicing it, and specifically with a coach or someone who can provide feedback, because feedback's essential. But this is what Scott feels is the way to excellence for therapists, is to really drill, to drill their skills, or to practice skills deliberately, intentionally, with feedback over time. He's felt that what separates super shrinks from the rest of us is not necessarily an inborn capacity, but is that they engage in deliberate practice, that they take time to foster their capacities, in particular skills in therapy. So Scott is indeed the deliberate practice guy. That's what he sort of, that's his contribution in some ways in the direction of psychotherapy
I like
excellence.
what Scott says in this article on psychotherapy.net. And he says, within the last year, we've started to teach this basic formula for success to therapists. And so this is from the article Super Shrinks, What is the Secret of Their Success by Barry Duncan and Scott Miller, and going down to a formula for success. So each component of the formula, number one, is determining your baseline of effectiveness. So he describes effectiveness could be measured by ORS, SRS, other clinical standardized measures, but however you want to look at effectiveness. So determining your baseline, then engaging in deliberate practice. So as you're pointing to, very specific. So I'm going to learn how to improve my paraphrasing or reflective listening or my goal setting, with clients. So a very specific skill, and getting feedback, number three, depends on and is informed by others working in tandem to create a cycle of excellence.
There it is. That's what it's all about. I think if we just go right away into like thoughts on this, like I think this is a missing component to therapy that's really needed, right? Like when I think about, do we drill? Like, do we ever drill? Like, maybe in your first year, counseling and interpersonal skills class, you would practice reflecting and open-ended questions and closed-ended questions and summaries and things like that. But and you might drill that. You might, have a partner and you just practice all class and whatever, right? But I think after a certain point, as you start to engage with clients and things like that and get into the practicum and internships and such, you stop drilling, or there's no emphasis upon drilling or practicing scenarios, deliberately trying to improve your capacity to work with them. And I mean, to me, it makes a ton of sense that we would do that, right? Like, or at least it makes some sense to me. Like, I'm sort of two minds about this, and we can get into that. But I think that there's a lot of value in what Scott's saying. So I'll start with that. I did want to find I just stumbled on it a while ago. It was him and another researcher, and they did a study looking at how, like, feedback in the context of deliberate practice improved outcomes for the therapists who were engaged in that practice versus when there was no feedback present. People didn't really get better. So there were like these these sort of simulated encounters where therapists had to sort of practice how they would respond, how they might engage the clients or respond to the clients in these particular scenarios. And in the absence of any feedback, people tended to do about the same over time. So despite multiple trials, they didn't really get better. But when there was feedback, they improved. Like, you could notice an improvement. So when there was specific feedback, it was Scott Miller and Daryl Chow who had looked at feedback in the context of deliberate practice together, and it was an essential element. The research showed, like,
He's a great podcast, by the way.
Yeah. I should listen to him. Yeah. Okay. So here, like, I made reference to the fact that I have two minds, so I should probably say my other mind. Like, I haven't had a chance to really practice or to engage in deliberate practice the way that Scott Miller really describes it, I think. But I guess one of the things that I come up against is this idea that we can really, I don't want to say really improve, but like, there's something I'm reading into this in a way of like, okay, I'm sort of practicing my scripted responses for when certain kinds of experiences come up with patients. Like, I'm going to rehearse in my head, or I'm going to practice a certain kind of response. And that there's the possibility of kind of spontaneity being stifled. And to me, like, the way I understand therapy, it's hard to understand how I could practice deliberately the kind of therapy that I do, given that the only way to really know how or to go through the process with the client is to go through it with them. Like, I question the validity of practicing through virtual scenarios and things like that. There's something that feels kind of programmatic in his recommendations, that, like, he's sort of suggesting that we practice to the point of not perfection, but that we get rehearsed in the way that we approach clients. Maybe that's how I'm reading into it, is that we get rehearsed. Yeah.
Mm.
And to me, it feels kind of troubling, this idea that we would sort of rehearse responses, or like that's maybe one way of understanding deliberate practices
It's a
as
way of,
rehearsal. Yeah.
yeah, but I would say that that's what it feels like. And I have
Yeah.
some experience learning acting a little bit as well as some other areas. We drill, and I think it does apply to things like psychotherapy skills and to, again, this whole area of human performance that Anders Ericsson was talking about, so that actually the skill becomes now in our subconscious, it becomes what we have is now that unconscious competence,
Mm-hmm.
so that then that can be applied with fluidity. So instead of having to really be like, oh my gosh, should I use a paraphrasing or should I use a reflection? It becomes intuitive in what we use, and it becomes very fast and intuitive in terms of what we use. And also in supervision around this too, we often talk about providing choice points. So it's very rare that there's only one thing that is the right answer, right? But there are probably a few things. It's not necessarily infinite, certainly not infinite, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a few things. So we call it choice points that could help the client, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it is kind of a hypothesis, right? Or in mentalism, they also call this cold reading, almost in a sense. Like, we're going to try this thing. We're going to try be, an empathic reflection, or I'm going to try, making a focusing statement, or I'm going to, right? So we could try different things, right? And we'll learn over time what tends to work in more situations than not. And
Right.
also, of course, we learn that there could be cultural differences. The next wave of research is seeing how can we match therapy, our stance in therapy, the subtlety of certain skills to particular populations, right? And particular issues, right? So to really, enhance things. We know that doing facilitative interpersonal skills, and I was talking with the team at Skill Setters that there's research that that applies whether, you're working with a couple or an individual or an indigenous client or an Arabic client, right? Those are universal skills. But there's then maybe additional skills, additional competencies, certainly that we could do to improve further with
Yeah.
subpopulations. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it may be good to acknowledge, Richard, that you're more tapped
Mhm.
into this world, and you made reference to Skill Setter a couple of times. It would probably be good to say a little bit to our audience about that. I know you and I are gonna
Mhm.
try to get into that a bit, and I'm excited for that. After watching the talk at the CCPA conference. But do you want to speak to sort of like the next step in this, which is like feedback informed deliberate practice and feedback informed therapy? Do you want to just maybe speak a little bit to that as the final point, like
Mhm.
this is really, the culmination of Scott's theorizing
Mhm.
is getting to these places, right? A deliberate practice and feedback informed therapy. So maybe you can say a little bit about that, and that will bring us home on Scott Miller. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And Skill Setter. Yeah.
Skill Setter, what it's trying to do, and I think it's kind of rare in the therapy field. And again, Wampold is their chief scientist, and they're really onboarding a lot of researchers, a lot of universities to even just experiment with their platform. Certainly, then, the idea is to have both therapists in training and even professionals in other fields that need to improve in their interpersonal skills. They'll have a video of actors who are playing a particular difficult scenario. So perhaps, the actor is playing a client in denial around their alcohol use and they're very angry. And it's like 3, 2, 1, go. First of all, it gives, how do I deal with this? And it gives you kind of your score based on your facilitative interpersonal skills. And then with their AI system, right, it's building feedback on what you could do to improve, or this is what we would, suggest. So I'm going to try to practice and it can be down to a specific point. I'm going to practice empathic reflection, with this client. I'm going to practice doing an emotion, helping the client doing an emotion regulation intervention, right?
Right.
So it's that level of fine tuning, and it gives feedback. And it's kind of that. Otherwise, the only time that we get this kind of really frequent direct coaching, right, is if we're we might have a supervisor who is doing direct video feedback, but again, they could be too theory focused. So even there, that could be an issue, right? But it's really those basic, those counseling skills courses, right? And we
Yeah.
might have one course, early in the program, perhaps one from undergrad, one early in a graduate program. And could we be a lot? That's kind of the argument, the question that Skill Center is putting out there. Could therapists be so much better if we gave them a lot more opportunity along their career from the beginning to ongoing in an ability to practice their skills through a platform such as this?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Is our facilitative interpersonal skills, is that a direct extension of Scott Miller's deliberate practice? Like, was his conclusion that facilitative interpersonal skills are the things that we ought to practice deliberately, or where did that come from?
Well, that was in a recent podcast episode with Wampold and Scott Miller. They
Okay.
referenced Tim Anderson's research
Right.
that this
Okay.
does seem to be critical and improving. Does he use that term a lot in the research that I've seen from Scott Miller? It doesn't seem to come up tons. Again, he
Okay.
talks a lot about the engagement, but yes, it was
Yeah.
recently
Okay.
referenced in Wampold's
Right.
podcast. Yeah, which I was
Okay.
excited to hear that that they really credited Tim Anderson as this is one of the most, they
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
said this is one of the most important papers in psychotherapy research to
Hmm.
actually look at what are the skills that across modalities, kind of put
Yeah.
modalities aside, that seem to help build alliance engagement, however you want to term this, and then improve,
Right.
outcomes with clients. Yeah.
I see now why when you made reference to
Yeah.
him sort of saying,
Yeah.
do we really need theory, right? You're saying that
Yeah.
ultimately, like, his research concluded that it was a set of skills that are most facilitative of effective outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he developed a scale that rates, Anderson invented a scale that rates the therapist a
Mm.
lot in their ability, right, to use these skills. So that means it can be
Right.
kind of actualized.
Yeah. It can
Right.
be like
Yeah.
therapist can be
Hmm.
assessed. Okay. Well, it
Yeah.
sounds like he's there's a figure that we need to devote another episode to.
I know. I was just
Entirely.
kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
getting into that a little
Yeah.
bit as we were preparing for this
Yeah.
episode.
No, it's
There's
good.
just
It's good.
no, it could be a
Yeah.
part 2 or something.
Yeah. No.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
maybe,
Mm.
6 episodes from now when we do the Great Psychotherapy Debate again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it wouldn't be fair to end the episode before we say a little
Mm.
bit more about feedback-informed therapy, because that is,
Absolutely.
like, in addition to deliberate practice, that is also like the legacy of Scott Miller is engaging clients for feedback at the end of every session, like explicitly inviting feedback as a way of informing the therapy process. So again, deviating from modality is not like our modal understanding of what's indicated is not as
Mhm.
helpful as when we just get some feedback from the client. Like, nothing's going to beat
That's
that.
right.
Yeah.
Am I going the right direction?
Yeah.
Did I meet your, some of the questions, right? Did I meet your expectations? Did
Yeah.
we actually accomplish what you set out today? What did we miss? Right?
Yeah.
What could
Yeah.
I cover next session that I did not cover? What can I do
Yeah.
more of?
Yeah.
Right? So providing a better customer experience, so to speak, for clients.
I'm kind of reading it like not so
Right.
much as like I'm kind of reading it more as a way of engaging your interpersonal process with the client too, right?
It is an interpersonal.
Yeah, because it's a little bit of like, at least the way that I'm thinking about it. And again, this is my preference for a relational style of psychotherapy, but it was sort of, how was the session for you? Like, certainly, did you have the experience that you were hoping for? And then if you didn't, what does that mean, right? And can that take us into a kind of transference, or does it at least just give me some information about where you're at, like, and what's coming
Well,
up
it
for
also
you, right?
tells you, what is getting in the way, right?
Yeah,
Which is
right,
important. I
right, yeah.
often think about, right, what are the barriers of the relationship, the barriers in trusting me, right? Those are
Mm.
some of the scales, right? And it's a very
Yeah.
simple scale, the
Right,
ORS and SRS.
right.
They're like 4 or 5 questions.
No, so I think it's neat. I mean, I know Scott, like, he's a proponent that if you practice in this way, that you need to do feedback at the end of every session. It's not an occasional thing.
Absolutely.
And I
yeah.
think right now I'm more of an occasional feedback guy. Yeah.
I can do that too. Yeah, I think
yeah.
I can tend to do that. And yeah, he was saying if you only do it with some of the time you don't
Yeah.
really get better. You have to do it
Yeah,
across
yeah,
this wide gamut of clients and frequently, or you
yeah,
just don't improve, is
yeah,
what the
yeah,
research
yeah.
was saying. Yeah.
I think what I'm drawing
Hmm.
from Scott, both from the deliberate practice and from the feedback informed therapy end, is that he's saying it's really important that we try to make ourselves visible to ourselves. That it's kind of easy in some ways to
Yes.
fall into a kind of
Yes.
automaticity, or to just get
Hmm.
complacent, or to land at a certain level of competency, and then we don't see, like,
Yeah.
somehow it becomes invisible, the ways that
Yes.
we could
Well
still
said.
improve. Yeah. And so he's saying, like, he's really understanding feedback as an antidote to that. Like, it makes something visible
Yeah.
again. It keeps us,
It shakes us up.
yeah, it keeps us
Hmm.
connected to ourselves, to the client, to the process. So to me, that
That's
feels really
right.
valuable. Yeah. Yeah, I think, to land on final thoughts about Scott Miller, I mean, I think I've really enjoyed this episode. I've really appreciated learning about him. And, he's a figure who's really shaken up the debate. Like, it's really refreshing. He's come in, and he's really
Hmm.
completely thrown out this sort of modal approach to the debate. He's not
Yeah.
interested in the modality anymore, and
Yeah.
he's trying to capture something more essential about effectiveness. And to me, that's really, really important and really special. And so I'm excited to engage around skill setter with you, Richard, and to sort of, like, maybe we'll be able to produce some content around that for our listeners, around what that process is like and such. But
Hmm.
as an extension of Scott Miller's positionality. It's interesting. Like, there are critical positions that I'm still holding in regards to Scott Miller, and they're mostly
Hmm.
connected to my own, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic bent in terms of therapy. Like, I don't know that everything that Scott Miller feels is important in psychotherapy is commensurate with what I feel is important in psychotherapy. But I also don't necessarily think that that's a make it or break it, kind of place for Scott and I. Like, I can appreciate what he's doing, and maybe one day we'll get him on the podcast. I mean, that
Hmm.
would be great, and we could aspire to that, and that would probably help to clarify, because I think there's still a gap in terms of what I've learned about Scott and what I could learn about Scott's position, and he might have more to say, and we might have more in common than I think. So, but
I
I've really
love that.
appreciated learning about him. Yeah, and maybe you have some final thoughts before we wrap up, Richard. Yeah.
Yeah, my final thoughts is ask the client. The client knows many things, and in their body language and verbally, and this idea that Scott talks about ad infinitum, of create a culture of feedback, right? How do we make it safe for clients to share the feedback? How do we become more, as you said, transparent to ourselves, but transparent to the client, right? Kind of reveal the veil behind, the Wizard of Oz. I think that is something I want to leave people with, is to really think about, how can I personally and in my organization or in the group practice I've set up, et cetera, my university, contribute to creating a culture of feedback for the other therapists, for the clients, right? For supervisees, supervisors, this cycle of excellence and culture of feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. That, I would say, I agree. That's maybe one of the most valuable contributions to me. Like, we can't see everything, so we need support for these things to be visible to us sometimes, and that can be tremendously valuable. So I'm aligned to that dimension of his project for sure. Yeah.
Well, I love doing this episode with you, Glenn.
Yeah, same here, Richard. This was really great, and thanks to everyone for listening tonight.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.